We need to know today. That was it. All right. All right. Well, come about the first week of December, Kent sends me a text, says, "I want you to do 10 minutes on dating." And I thought, that's a horrible plan. I only dated one woman in my life. And it wasn't really dating. It was more like waiting for her to agree to marry me. So I've only been on one other official date, and I was in high school, and it did not go well. So, but anyways, he clarified later, and carbon dating. Well, I can do that, but I got to do that in 10 minutes? That seems kind of ridiculous. And I was sweating it the whole day, and then he said, well, we'll give you a whole hour. And then I was like, oh, wow, I can do that, but then you're going to want to hear something else too. So, anyways, he did kind of pump you up this morning and say we're going to talk about the statistical probability of Jesus fulfilling all the prophecies and stuff. We had to nits that. We didn't have time for that. So we're going to leave that off till next time, but you should have fun. Anyway, so we're going to talk about more on the religions of science or how carbon dating came to age the world. Okay? So I have created a nice little diagram to help you guys learn what carbon dating is. And let's see here. Does that work? It's not working. Oh. Hold on. Which way did I go? There we go. Ooh, see, that's the problem. Very touchy. That's going to be a problem. Okay, so like most problems that the Earth has, it starts with cosmic rays that come from the sun. Okay, and what happens is, see, this is going to be an issue. Those cosmic rays hit the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, and we have these helium atoms that roam around in the atmosphere, free-ranging helium atoms. Okay, these cosmic rays basically bombard the nuclei of the atom, which makes a newly homeless neutron floating around. Okay, that newly homeless neutron finds a lonely nitrogen, which creates an emancipated proton and a rather desperate carbon-14 atom. Okay, so carbon does not like to be alone at all. So what happens is it runs into some lonely oxygen. Okay, and that creates this radioactive carbon dioxide. Okay, so it's carbon-14 dioxide. Now, normally carbon dioxide is carbon-12. Okay, now the typical, basically, ratio of these is going to be 1 trillion of these for every one of these. Okay, so it's 1 trillion, 1,000 billion. There's a bunch. Okay, there's not too much of this stuff going on. Now, what happens is we have trees on the planet, right? And what do trees do? Trees breathe in carbon dioxide, right? We remember from our high school math science classes. Okay, so what happens is what's called carbon fixation. Okay, the trees basically breathe the carbon in. They go through photosynthesis and stuff. They strip off the oxygen, they output it so that we can breathe and have life, because the Lord's plan is very good. And then they fix that carbon into their tissues. Okay, and then let's see, and so it also goes into like the grass and stuff that's around in the environment, the bushes, basically everything that is an organic plant matter takes it up. Okay, and then we're also on Earth, so we have water. And that water, due to gas solubility, takes up the carbon-14 dioxide too. Okay, which then you have all the plants in the water, so the algae and the seaweed and all that jazz takes it up. And we have crops like wheat and things like that, grains, that all take it up too. Now, what happens is along comes, say, a cow. Okay, that cow eats some grass. Okay, that grass brings the carbon-14 into him. Now, we also have a chicken, which eats the worms and jazz and the grass and stuff, and it uptakes it as well. Then you have fish in the ocean that eat some of the algae and the seaweed and stuff. Then you have slightly bigger fish that eat that fish, and another bigger fish that comes on and eats that fish. Okay, so the carbon basically moves down through the food chain. Now, because you got all these cows and chickens and stuff, you got to have a farm. If you got a farm, you're going to have a farmer. Okay, so that farmer, he eats some of the grain. Okay, so he's uptaking the carbon that way. And then he milks the cow, and he drinks the milk, takes that, and the farmer gets desperate, and he eats the chicken. Okay, so he's taking that to the meat too. Okay, now because he ate his chicken, he really likes meat, so he eats a cow. Okay, so then he takes it through that. So it moves all down through the food chain. Okay, now because he ate his cow and a chicken, and he needs more food, he sends his sister out to fish. Okay, his sister fishing brings the carbon from the ocean into the living organisms as well. Okay, now Winter comes, they get cold, they cut down the trees, okay, kill the trees. And then they killed the chicken, so there's your dead chicken, okay. They killed your cow, so there's your dead cow. And because it's winter, and they killed their cow and their chicken, and the ocean froze over, they died, okay. So, this is what we call in technical terms life cessation, okay, because scientists tend to like to have big names for stuff. So life cessation is death, okay, which occurs, then this carbon fixation stops, okay, so they're no longer taking the carbon-14 in and the carbon-12 in from the atmosphere, so that when that stops, then we can have fun with things like carbon dating. Now let's talk about half-life first, okay. Say we have a big lump of carbon-14, okay, a pound of it. The half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, okay. What that means is 5,730 years later, you will have half a lump of carbon-14, okay, or half a pound. That's all half-life is, okay. It's nothing too complicated. Yep. Okay, so here's the basic process. If you find something that is organic in origin and you want to date it with carbon dating, use the following procedure. You send it to a certified carbon dating lab. Now your question will first be, what makes a certified carbon dating lab? They say they're good at it, okay? That's how it works. They measure the amount of carbon-14 versus carbon-12 with a mass spectrometer, an expensive piece of equipment basically. And then using an assumed fixed ratio of 1 carbon-14 to a trillion carbon-12s, they work out how much carbon-14 is missing, okay? Once you know how much is missing, well, see. Sorry, I'm having using the wheel on the mouse and it's causing trouble. So once you know how much is missing versus what you have, you can use the known half-life to work out how old the object is. So, very delicately, we'll move that forward. See, now I want to go. Oh, is the problem my pointer off the screen? Well, where is it? If it was on the screen, I could probably use it better. Okay. The problem was it wouldn't work. So, now it'll work since the pointer's on the screen. Thank you. So, some of the problems, okay? Even the best equipment that we have, okay, we can't detect carbon-14 past about 7 or 9 half-life cycles, okay, because it keeps reducing and reducing and reducing down, and our equipment's only so good. 7 cycles is about 40,000 years at in the best situation, okay, if everything was perfect. Is extremely difficult to validate the results from carbon dating, okay, and the only way we can really do so is with comparison with the objects that are known to be of a certain age, okay. So, can you think of something that is very easy to know by the age of observation? It's not a rhetorical question you're allowed to answer now. Trees, good job, okay, so trees. So, how about some tree rings, okay? And this is actually the best way we have to do it, okay? So, does anybody know what this is? It is a tree. Can anybody be slightly more specific? It is the oldest living thing currently on the planet, okay? This is a bristle cone pine tree. Its name is Methuselah, okay? I love how they named it after a biblical character. Fantastic, okay? So it's the oldest single living organism on the earth today, and it's this bristle cone pine tree named Methuselah. It was counted to be 4,844 years old, okay? Does anybody know the name of what is known to have been the oldest thing to have ever lived? It's another bristlecone pine tree called Prometheus, okay? This is Prometheus today, okay? What happened is the government sent this rather bright scientist out to count how old these trees were. So he took a French tool and he bored a hole in the side of the tree, and his tool broke. Now, being the bright scientist that he was, and he had to count this tree, he went and found a lumberjack and cut the tree down, okay, because he's a bright guy, okay. Now, when we did this, okay, we found that he didn't know the tree was this old. Nobody had any idea that these trees were anywhere near this old, so that's in his favor. But named Prometheus, it's been counted to be 4,950 years old, okay, so it's old. Now, and that was in 1964 when he cut it down. This is what we have of Prometheus. It's a chunk here, this line right here. That's where he broke his tool off. So he cut the whole tree down to get that out. So the problem that we have with the tree rings, if you've looked at old trees or old wood, the rings toward the center compress. So the older the tree is, the thinner the rings get towards the middle, and the middle ones are the older one, the younger ones are the outer one, okay? What happens is when you get a tree that's 4,950 years old, the rings toward the center are so close together that they physically can't count them, okay? They popped it underneath an electron microscope and everything. They physically can't really tell the difference. So what they do, they decided to carbon date it, and they used differential carbon dating through the rings to count how many rings there were. And then they used that to validate their carbon dating. A rather interesting concept. You don't usually use one method to justify itself. It's a rather strange nature of things. So now we just relax and we look at a peekaboo kitty. Okay. This is what I wish the carbon dating scientists were looking at instead of tree rings. Okay. And what they do is, oh, see, now we're down here with this thing. Boom. Okay. So we're done with that page. And we're done with that page. So they use these tree rings to create these rather boring graphs, okay, that they use. And then what they've done is they've dug up old trees, okay, and they carbon dated the rings in that tree, and they use that to line that tree ring up with some tree rings from Prometheus so that they can count further back. So again, they're using their dating to create their scale for their dating. And the scale is used to modify the ranges of the ages and stuff. So it's a self-fixing thing according to them. Some interesting problems here, one of which, does the rate of carbon-14 in the atmosphere remain constant? This is one of the big deals because they tell us there's a constant ratio of one of these to a trillion of these, okay? In order for that to be constant, that would mean that the rate of removal or the rate of decay of carbon-14 was equal to its rate of production. However, the problem is that it's not. If you assume that the initial atmosphere had no carbon-14 in the atmosphere, it should take about 30,000 years for it to reach equilibrium. And we can measure today that the rate of production is about 18.8 atoms per gram of total carbon in the world. And the rate of decay is actually 16.1. Now what you need to know is that the rate of production is greater than the rate of decay, which means that since we're not dumping as much as we're making, that we have not reached that point, that initial point of equilibrium yet, which means that, and since the production is significantly higher, it would suggest that the Earth is not actually all that old. Okay? Things affecting carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Okay, we have this Earth's atmosphere here that's affecting this cosmic rays, and since this is what's generating our homeless neutrons, things that affect that would be like the magnetic field of the Earth. Okay, so we have this magnetic field, and it protects us from that harmful radiation. It can be measured to this really brilliant guy named Gauss back in the 1850s-ish, and it can be measured that it's been found to get weaker over time, okay? And when the magnetic field was higher, less radiation would have entered the atmosphere, and thus less carbon-14 would have been produced. The interesting part about that is today, the field is 10% weaker than it was when Gauss originally measured it in 1845, okay? The interesting thing about that is that given the rate of degradation that we're seeing, it would indicate that the magnetic field's about 10,000 years old, which is kind of cool, okay? Now, when a scientist reads that, he goes, well, it regenerates itself. Why, we don't know, but it works. So, anywho, sometimes I wish we'd take scientists and we'd strap 10-year-old kids to their back, and they had to speak everything they thought out loud, and the 10-year-old would say, what? Doesn't make any sense. It's also been discovered that the rate of production is dependent upon your geographic location. Okay, it turns out that we're making carbon-14 a lot faster at the equator than we are at the poles. Okay, can anybody think of why? Exactly. These cosmic rays hit say the magnetic field. If you're at the equator, you're going directly through. If you're at the pole, you get things like the aurora borealis and stuff like that. Whereas actually that's ionizing the atmosphere, but it's bouncing off, so it has a lot less effect. What's interesting about that is they tend to do a lot of carbon dating on ice and stuff that's in the poles. And since there's a lot less, but they're using the same ratio that they get from here up at their pole. So why? Who knows? It's a good question. Now remember, it's also one of these to a trillion of these. So what happens if there's two of these to a trillion of these? You've doubled your number. Holy smokes, that's a big difference. It doesn't take much when you're talking about 1 in a trillion to make a huge difference. So even if it's half, if there's half of these to a trillion of those, you got a big problem. Your number is now millions of years off just because of a one little digit there. So, what would that be? All right, we did a lot of interesting tests during the 40s and 50s, right? Okay. Nuclear bombs have a lot of radiation, okay? They really dump a lot of radiation into the atmosphere, which creates a lot of issues with ionizing carbon-14 and things like that, which throws off their ratios a lot. Now, these are things that we've seen in the last 100 years that are significantly affecting their ratio. Does anybody know what this is? That's right, that's a volcano. This particular one's in Greenland. Really cool. Volcanoes have a massive effect on geologic timescale in a lot of ways, but this particular one we're talking about carbon-13, so they release a ton of carbon in the atmosphere, okay? They also release a lot of gases and stuff that affect the ionization process, but they're so big, these are them from space, okay? So this is actually that same volcano from space right there at the point, I think that was like 4 or 5 hours after it erupted. So it's making a big difference. And it has a large impact on local creation of carbon-14, but also on a global scale, okay? So those are all things that are tweaking with their probabilities. The other thing is we have our cows and our chickens eating our carbon. Do organisms fixate carbon-14 at the same way that they fixate carbon-12? That would be a big difference because that would affect everything, okay? What's interesting, if you go to Hawaii, and you pick up a snail and you pop the snail out and you carbon date its shell, it turns out that it carbon dates to be over 2,000 years old. Now, the snails only live about 12 years. And when you ask them, well, why does it measure to be 2,000 years old? They go, we don't know. Okay. But, hey, it still works. So let's move on from there. Okay. Some other things that we know that affects it. For instance, maybe the flood, okay? The flood, what happens when you flood the entire earth is you remove a lot of carbon, okay? All that vegetation and stuff gets churned over, and what that does, that removes all the living organisms basically creating today's fossil fuel supply, okay? Interesting note about the fossil fuels is that if you look at the level of fossil fuels in the world today, that indicates that there's about 500 times more living organisms prior to the flood than there are now, which would not only dilute the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, it blows it off the map, okay? Which would indicate that everything that's measured in age that we believe to have lived pre-flood, if you measure it now, it's going to turn out to be a lot older than it actually is. It's going to test to be a lot older than it really is. Which is what we see. So that's a number one problem there. Boom, boom, boom. Next page. So inherently, the problem is that the preconceived notions of age bias the results. Okay. What happens when a lab gets something that it thinks is young? It measures it and it comes out young. They say, "Yay, it's young." If they think it's old and they measure it and it comes out young, they go, there must have been contamination. That's a problem. We're going to throw that out. Okay. Does anybody know what this is? Coal. Exactly right. Okay. Now, coal is believed to be produced by a significant amount of pressure and heat and timed, and according to scientists, must be millions of years old. Okay. Does it just take that long to make it? Does anybody know what this is? It's an uncut diamond, that's right. Okay, and the uncut diamonds are even older, right? Because they take the coal and a lot more heat and a lot more pressure and a lot more time, and you get diamonds. So they must be hundreds of millions of years old. And they're evidently really deep down and very hard to get, and it must be a very dirty process, which means since it's far down in the earth, it must be really, really old. Okay, so how old is it? If you take something that's really, really old, and how much carbon-14 would you expect to have in it when you check it? None. Okay, basically the half-life would reduce it, especially if it's past that 7 to 9 half-life cycles. It reduce it to the point that you couldn't measure it. So effectively, it would be carbon-14 dead, is what they call it. Okay, that's why they don't measure stuff that they think is too old, because obviously there won't be anything in it. Okay, the interesting thing is that what happened was the scientists took 10 samples that they got from the government of coal, and they sent 10 samples to a carbon dating lab, and they had them date them. Okay. The interesting thing is that they all found carbon-14 in them, and they measured to be about 47,000 years old, which is definitely not hundreds of millions of years. Okay, they actually found that the level is about 0.25% of current atmospheric levels, which is about 7.5 life cycles. Okay, and that was in all 10 samples. All 10 samples measured exactly the same, and they declared it to be contamination, and because they have to be far older than that. Okay, so once again, the 10-year-old goes, "What?" Okay, they may know what this is. Fossils. Okay, fossils of a dinosaur. They may know which dinosaur. Who's the real nerd? Ah, see, we're getting there. It's an allosaur. Okay, actually, one of the most common fossils we have are allosaurs. The interesting thing with the allosaur is what happened is this guy named Hugh Miller, who's a Christian. He actually owns some allosaur bones. Okay, and he took a bone and he broke it. And because if you send them a dinosaur bone, they go, "Hey, it's a dinosaur bone. It's too old. We're not going to date it." So he broke it and told them it's an unknown bone. He sent them 2 samples, and they looked sort of like this, okay, old bone. And they took and they asked, "Well, how old is it?" It measured to be 10,000 to 16,000 years old, both samples. Okay, now I don't know about you, but that's slightly different than their preconceived notion that they're 60 million years old. The issue here is not that we're saying it's not 60 million years old, because that falls into the old Earth, new Earth argument, which is a valid argument, and there's some really interesting pros and cons of that. And I firmly believe that Christians can fall on both sides of the new world and old world. The interesting thing is that they believe that this is the way it has to be, okay, versus what they actually get out of it. So they're building their whole philosophy of the way that the universe was built on stuff that is not necessarily true. And everything that they know tells them it's probably not true, yet they still believe it. An interesting policy. Now, there's an interesting quote here from Dr. Robert Lee back in 1981. He talks about carbon dating, a very famous carbon dating scientist. He says, "The troubles of radiocarbon dating method are undeniable and deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged, and warnings are out that radiocarbon may soon find itself in a crisis situation. Continuing use of the method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach, allowing for contamination here, fractionation there, and calibration whenever possible. It should be no surprise then that fully half the dates are rejected. The wonder is surely that the remaining half has come to be accepted. No matter how useful it is, though the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. The gross discrepancies, the chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually those that are just selected." Okay? And that was from a carbon dating scientist himself, who obviously thinks that their science is a bunch of hogwash. So, what we have to think of here is when the world believes one thing and the Bible teaches another, it's very tempting to think that God got the details wrong. And how often have we found God to be wrong so far? None. Okay, you're allowed to be very vocal about that. None. Okay, we haven't proven him wrong yet. So I tend to fall on his cycle there. So now